Does your snare drum sound like I'm sorry, let me rephrase that better. Do you think your snare drum's just a lost cause and it is never gonna sound good? Let me guess. You've already tried tuning it over and over again and again. Or you've already went out and you tried buying new drum heads hoping that that would be the solution. And you've probably even gone as far to go out because you were so frustrated. You went to Guitar Center, you bought a brand new snare drum because you thought the old one was useless and you thought this new one was just gonna surprisingly somehow magically fix it?
Okay, the last one was just me.
Okay, yeah, unfortunately that last part is true. I did do that. I had a good snare drum already and I went out and bought another one thinking that mine was just defected or that I just sucked as a drummer. You do suck. Fix your life. But I figured there's gotta be at least one person out there who's been through the same thing as me, right?
Nope.
Or at least something similar to it. And if not, well, good for you, gold star. If you want to stay around and just watch me talk about stuff you already know, then feel free. Be my guest. But for those of you who do know what I'm talking about, what if I told you that the problem with your snare drum isn't that you aren't tuning it correctly, it's not that you have the wrong drum heads. What if I told you that it could be as simple as just the adjustment of your snare wires? See, when I got my first drum kit, I never did anything with the snare wires. The most I did was I turned them on and off, but I had never actually taken them off. So when the day came when I finally had to take off the snare wires and put them back on, I realized I was going to need some help. So I did like everybody does these days, and I went on YouTube and I looked for some videos on how to install my snare wires. And yes, I did come across a good few videos, but I still felt as if they were very brief and they didn't really go into detail as much as I thought they could have. It seemed like they just expected me to know how to do it from the day of birth. And for me, that was pretty discouraging. So I'm going to show you how I install my snare wires. So quickly, before we start, I just wanted to talk about different snare wire options that there are out there. They vary from 16 strands and even up to 42 strands. If you're wondering what the difference between this many strands means, put simply, the fewer wires that you have, the tighter, faster, snappier response you're going to get from your snare drum. And the more wires you have, you're known to get more of a punchy, fuzzy, kind of buzzy sound, if that makes any sense. Now, the two most common things you're going to use to actually hold your snare wires in place are going to be string and straps. You can use whichever one you like. For me personally, what I use is Pure Sound 20 strand snare wires. If you're curious about them at all, I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to check them out. And one final tip before we get started. I just want you to make sure that your snare wires are not bent, crooked, damaged at all, because that's just going to ruin everything. Also, one more thing to note, just make sure that the straps or strings or whatever you're using are not super old and not worn out or worn down, because that could ruin the whole process too. But now that that is all out of the way, let's get to it.
Okay, so the first thing we're actually going to do is turn off the snare wires. So using your snare strainer, just flip that into the off position so the snare wires aren't actually touching the resonant head anymore. Then I want you to loosen the tension rods that actually hold the strings and straps in place. And then after that, I want you to loosen the dial that controls the tension for the snare wires. I want you to loosen it as much as you can. Some are different, some just stop at a certain point, and some will keep going until they actually disconnect from the snare throw. So if it's going to disconnect, just tighten it just to where it's on there. Get it as loose as you can. If you have two dials like I do the same exact thing on each one. I usually like to dial them up as much as I can so they're at the same tension, and then loosen them together so they stay at the same tension. Okay, now this is probably the most important part. So before you actually put the snare wires on, I want you to make sure the drum throw is in the on position. If you're wondering why, basically, this way, after you place the snare wires on evenly, they're going to have to stay that way because the wires are basically already in the on position. So now that we have that, now you can go ahead and put your snare wires on. Now, once you feel like the snare wires are relatively even, I want you to actually go ahead and get those tension rods finger tight. A good way to ensure that you're even is make sure you're looking directly from above. Make sure your snare drum is on a very flat surface, and look at the butt end of the snare wires, and you'll see that they're touching each edge of the shell of the snare drum, and just make sure they look relatively exactly the same on each side. And like I mentioned before, just make sure that your strands aren't crooked or bending or have any damage to them at all at this point. And once you think the snare wires actually look straight, then you can go ahead, use your drum key, and fully tighten the tension rods.
So now we're going to flip the snare drum over to the batter head and we're going to dial in those snare wires. So your snare drum is probably not going to sound very good right now. So all we're going to do is, while hitting the drum head with our drumstick, we're going to use our other hand to dial up the tension to actually get the snare wires to hit the resonant head until we find that desired sound that we like. So that's about where I like my snare to be tuned. It's at like a warm note. It's still got some snap to it, and it's still got a little bit of that buzz action going on. But basically now all you really have to do is just play around with the tension while you're dialing up the snare wires. You can dial them back a bit, dial them up, just find the tension you like. But the snare wires should be seated perfectly, evenly, and you should not have any more problems with the drum. I'd love to know what kind of tuning you guys are going for with your snare drum, and I'd also love to know what snare drum you're currently using. So drop those in the comments for me. I'd love to hear. Also, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see a video on drum tuning, you can check that video out right here. So if you found anything from this video useful at all, if you even enjoyed it just a little bit, I would love if you would hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and comment down below what drumming videos you'd like to see next on this channel. That's pretty much it, guys. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.